Hi there, welcome to this build and flight review of a 45-inch wingspan Quiver, or at least it says Quiver on the plans, but essentially it's a scaled down Quaker, and particularly with a couple of the modifications I made to stick to that traditional Quaker look rather than on the plans, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, I've had quite a few flights with this and you can see it's still in one piece and looking great. So I thought it was about time that I did this build and flight review. Now, the first thing is we're building this from a great set of plans which I downloaded from the OuterZone website. And as I said, they're called the Quiver, but essentially it's a smaller Quaker. Now, the plans are really good, and there's a build article on OuterZone as well, which you can download, and that gives a few useful bits of information. And if you have a look in the description below this video, there will be a link to these plans and that build article. As I said, lots of information, really good set of plans to build from. There's a couple of things that niggled me a little bit about the plans, and I'll just mention those briefly. There's no centre line for the fuselage. I quite like plans where they show you a centre line so you know what kind of angle of incidence you've got on the wings and what kind of angle of down thrust you've got on the engine. But with this, it's not shown on the plans, and essentially you can take the line of the tailplane if you want. But I would have just liked that detail. I mean, it all worked out okay, and as you've seen, it flies fine. So there's enough information on the plans and it's accurate enough to get a good flying model. I just like that kind of information. Now, I said that this is essentially a smaller version of the Quaker, but I made a couple of modifications. On the plans, the wing tips are at the tip angles down to meet the underside of the wing, whereas that's not a traditional Quaker look. On the Quaker, you have the wing tips, you can see here they come up from the bottom to meet this flat top on the wing, and I think that's a really nice kind of iconic look of the Quaker, and I really wanted to retain that. In the build article, he said, the guy who wrote the article said it was just easier and it was simpler to do it that way, which to my mind is never a good reason to do something. And like I say, I much prefer it with those Quaker looking tips, and I think it gives that model a real distinction. Now, one of the other things that I've done to make it look more like a Quaker is I've added stringers. You can see on the fuselage here and on the top. The only stringer I didn't add, which is on the original plans, and you can see those on the OuterZone website as well, I didn't add a single one underneath. But I'm a real sucker for stringers. I love fuselages with stringers, and to my mind, that just makes this plane. And so, you know, it was a no-brainer to add them really, and I think it's a shame he didn't, because there's very little weight that's been added by adding those stringers. So the wings, if I just go back to the wing tips and the tailplane and the fin, on the plans it suggests using reed. I've never used reed before. Soak it in water, bend it round a former, and it's quite expensive. It's not that easy to get hold of, so I laminated them, and I really enjoy doing lamination. You get a lovely thin wingtip, it's nice and strong and sands well, and so I think that's a really good technique to use if you're going to build this. What else did I do? I put shear webbing on the struts just to add a little bit of strength to these wings. It's surprising how much strength and resilience you can add to a wing with very little weight. So I always think that's a really good thing to do. Now, if you've seen the build, you'll see I put in the servos, micro servos, on either side of the fuselage to operate the elevator and the tail, which is always a bit of a risky thing to do, particularly with a vintage model, perhaps with a short nose, where you want to keep the tail as light as possible, or even a warbird, I suppose, if you want to keep it really light. But we mocked it up, I worked out that we could get away with it, and by putting the battery right up front here, this balanced lovely. There's no added weight, or did I? I think I may have added about 10 grams of lead in the front, I think. Just a very small amount, but essentially nothing, and it's come out really nicely balanced and lovely and light. So I'm really pleased with it. Now, just see if I've got a list here, so I just didn't want to forget anything, and I thought I'd best to write a list. And okay, so the two things I haven't mentioned is I didn't do a tail skid. It shows on the plans a wire tail skid. I fly on grass and I just thought it might get caught and pulled out, and I couldn't really see the need for it and the need to add extra weight. Okay, very small amount. Having said that, it does sit on the rudder just a little bit, and as you operate the rudder you can just see the back of the fuselage wiggling, which isn't ideal, but I generally I generally don't use the rudder once I've landed, it's on the ground, and I think as it's flying it's not going to make any difference. I did wonder whether I should just add a little bit of a balsa keel just to lift it up a bit, which I might do eventually, but we'll see. And I think that is everything about the plans that I wanted to mention. So we'll move on to the flying now.
Nice. Lovely.
Well, hopefully you've seen the maiden flight video, and if you haven't, if you have a look in the description below this video, and there'll be a link to the playlist and all of the build articles and the maiden flight where you can have a look at that. But essentially the maiden went really well. I was really pleased with it. It just went away, no hesitation, and I think this Mills 1.3 diesel is really suited to this. I've seen them fly with a 0.75, and if it's a lovely calm day, that's fine. But if there's a little bit of a headwind, there's a little bit of falter there. But this engine being slightly bigger just gives it a little bit more authority and a little bit more confidence to break through that wind, or to fly into the wind anyway. So I was really pleased with it. The fuel tank was a good size. It's not a standard Mills tank, but it's the same size, and it will give you a few minutes of climbing up and then gliding, and I was really pleased with that. I wouldn't want anything bigger, and I wasn't waiting for it to run out either, because it was getting a little bit too high or too much. So I would say that was kind of ideal. I'm just going to look at my list again. Initially I had a little bit of an issue with it climbing quite steeply, and I was constantly feeding in the down elevator just so that it wasn't too steep a climb. I've since put a couple of washers under the back of the engine, just introduced a little bit of down thrust, and again it would be nice to know what down thrust was in there from the start. And so I've introduced a little bit of down thrust, and now that's made a huge difference. Because even though it was climbing quite steeply before I put the down thrust in, I was still getting a really nice glide. So the trim of the actual plane itself was just spot on, a lovely steady glide, which is nice. But it was just under power, it was climbing. And having put in those washers and that down thrust, it is now reduce that climb, so I'm getting a good steady climb just as I want it, and when the engine cuts I've still got that perfectly lovely flat glide, which is what we need. So yeah, a little bit of down thrust was needed. I think there's, oh, and probably the only last thing to say about the flying is that those control surfaces, which you can see are quite a decent size on this, give absolutely plenty of authority. In fact, the rudder itself is quite a big size. There's no underkeel like on the on my Diamond Demon, for example. You had to put in quite a lot of rudder because you've got a bit of an underkeel as well, which acts like a fin. But with this, it's very responsive to the rudder, and perhaps at the start, occasionally I was giving it a little bit too much rudder when I was just trying to bring it in or bring it into the area of the airfield. But anyway, lovely authority on that. One other thing I should say about the build, which I forgot to mention earlier, is when I put this Japanese Asuka tissue on top of the laminating film, sorry, I used a water-based polyurethane, which I know is diesel proof, and on the Diamond Demon I used a matte finish, and I thought I would use a silk finish on this, and I think the silk gives you a little bit better cleaning. I mean, the matte or the silk stands up well to the diesel and the oil, but I think just having a little bit of a sheen helps you clean it a little bit better. And I think this is probably my preferred finish. Obviously I don't want the high gloss, but a little bit of sheen is quite nice. And this pattern I really like. I know I was apprehensive about having the light pattern on the front at the beginning, but I'm quite pleased with that. But anyway, I'm going to stop talking now because I think I've said everything I wanted to. At the end of the day, I really like this plane. It flies lovely. It was a great build, and I can highly recommend using these plans, and if you want, use them in conjunction with the larger Quiver plans to make those, larger Quaker plans to make those changes like I made. But I can highly recommend you to go out and start building the Quiver. So anyway, thanks very much for watching, and there'll be another build series along very soon.
Lovely.